In this class, I am going to cover international commercial terms. When there is a movement of the goods involved in a sale, either it could be domestic sale or international sale, the seller and the buyer must carry certain obligations and costs while moving the goods from seller's place to the buyer's place. So these charges, costs include pre-delivery charges, loading, freight, insurance, export-import clearance, unloading at the buyer's place. So what do you mean by pre-delivery charges? Pre-delivery charges include packing, marking, weighment, and inspection for quality and quantity. So all these charges include into pre-delivery charges. So these charges are to be borne by the seller always, because it is the responsibility of the seller to keep the stock ready for delivery always. So pre-delivery charges. And then we have loading charges and the freight. So either seller or the buyer, they must arrange the transportation. So somebody has to take the responsibility of the loading, either seller or the buyer. And either seller or the buyer must arrange for insurance if required. And export clearance, that includes paying export duties. And in buyer's country, import clearance, again payment of duties, VAT, etc. And finally, unloading charges at the place of destination. So, seller and the buyer must understand who bears all these costs and the obligations. So, accordingly, they have to include in the sales contract. Similarly, the transfer of risks, where seller's risk passes to the buyer. What is the place of delivery, where the seller's risk passes to the buyer? Both the seller and the buyer must understand. So, apart from the cost, seller and the buyer must also understand what is the delivery point. That means where the seller's risk passes to the buyer. Otherwise, they may end up with some misunderstandings. I'll give you a small example. Suppose if you want to buy some furniture, you go to a showroom, and the showroom person, he is offering a free home delivery. So you purchased that item and he arranged the transportation. During the transportation, it met with an accident and the furniture got damaged. So you are asking the showroom person to replace the item, because you are thinking as a buyer that it is the responsibility of the seller to arrange the item and ensure that it is safely delivered at your place. So you are asking him to replace the item. Whereas showroom person's understanding is that he offered only free home delivery. That means he will pay only the transportation charges. So the seller is thinking that he is paying transportation charges but the item belongs to the buyer. So there is a confusion, there is a misunderstanding. So this type of misunderstandings may come up even for the sellers and the buyers in international trade. So that is the reason it is very essential that they must understand where the seller's risk passing to the buyer. What is the delivery point? See, sometimes seller may be arranging the transportation, but it does not mean that the seller's risk is passing to the buyer. So it does not depend on the cost. So at the request of the buyer, seller may be doing some additional service, or at the request of the seller, buyer may be doing some additional services. So it is very important that both the seller and the buyer must understand what is the delivery point, where the seller's risk passes to the buyer. Now, as a seller and the buyer, you have to include all these obligations, costs, and the delivery point in your sales contract very clearly. So if you have to include all these things in a sales contract, then naturally the sales contract length will be huge. So as a result, there is a possibility of misinterpretations, and that may lead to misunderstandings between the parties. And that too, if the sale is in the course of export and the contract is made not in the native language of the parties, and when the contract size is big, there is a more scope for misinterpretations and misunderstandings between the parties. So that is the reason the International Chamber of Commerce, they have drafted international commercial terms in the codified form the first time in the year 1936. After that, it was updated time to time depending upon the requirements in the trade. So far, it updated 8 times. Now, Incoterms 2020 is in force. It is the 9th version, 9th revision. So, international commercial terms talks about general obligations, allocation of the costs, and transfer of the risks. At what point seller's risk transfer to the buyer, but not title to the goods. Please remember that it is very important. Incoterms talks about the transfer of the risk, but not transfer of the title to the goods. It is not the transfer of the ownership. Transfer of the title of the goods is governed by some other laws. So it talks about risk, transfer of risk. What is the place of delivery? So these international commercial terms, they have given some abbreviated form, 3-letter abbreviated form. They have drafted against each term what are all sellers' obligations and what are all buyers' obligations. So if you adopt these terms in your sales contract, there is no need for you to include all these obligations into your sales contract. So, if you are adapting international commercial term in your sales contract, you must always give the source of international commercial terms, like Incoterms 2020. So suppose if you are comfortable with Incoterms 2010, the previous version, you can still adopt international commercial terms 2010 as long as buyer and the seller, they are comfortable with Incoterms 2010, you can still use it. So that is the reason you have to be very specific. The source of Incoterms, which revision, and these Incoterms are copyrighted. So that is the reason always you have to remember that whenever you are adopting certain international commercial term, you must also provide the source, that is Incoterms 2020 or Incoterms 2010 if you are comfortable with international commercial terms 2010. So these international commercial terms, they have classified as any mode or modes of transport, one classification. There are total 11 international commercial terms are there. So they have classified these 11 international commercial terms into two categories. One, any mode or modes of transport. So there are 7 terms are there under that. And the other classification is sea and inland waterways. There are 4 terms under that. Total put together 11 international commercial terms. So the objective of this session is to clearly understand these international commercial terms. So here, any mode, what do you mean by mode of transportation? Road, rail, air, sea, all these are modes of transportation. And you said here modes, any mode or modes of transport. Modes means more than one mode of transportation. Suppose there is a possibility that half of the journey through road and half of the journey by sea. That's called multimodal transportation. Multimodal. So more than one mode is involved. That is called multimodal transportation. So these 7 terms are used for any mode of transport. See, for example, if it is a road transportation, so road means truck can come up to the seller's warehouse where the goods are stored. That can be a delivery point. Suppose if it is rail, the seller may have to carry the goods up to the railway place. So what is the delivery point? Is the railway station. Suppose if it is shipments are by air, seller may have to carry the goods up to the carrier. Carrier means we call as a shipping company, any transport operator. So seller may have to carry the goods from his warehouse up to the carrier's place, that is shipping company place. So road transportation, rail transportation or air and sea. In case of sea shipments, what happens? Again, seller may deliver the container at a container yard. See, in case of sea shipments, you have two types of shipments. One, goods may be shipped through containers, or goods may be shipped in bulk. In bulk means loose cargo, or like a coal shipments or crude oil shipments. Say in case of sea shipments, either you can ship the goods in a container or you can ship the goods in bulk. Suppose if you are shipping the goods through container and you are a shipper, you are giving a full container load, then you may stuff the goods in container in your warehouse or in your factory and deliver this container at container yard of the shipping company. So if you are shipping a full container load, so you can get the empty container to your factory and stuff the goods and deliver to the shipping company at container yard. Suppose if you are not shipping the full container, suppose if you are shipping the half of the container, then probably you can carry the goods to container freight station, CFS, container freight station. So you can deliver the goods there and goods can be stuffed in the container because you are giving a half of the goods of the container. So in one container there is a possibility of loading 2 shippers' cargo. So if you are loading on LCL basis, less container load, then you can carry the goods to the container freight station where the goods will be stuffed in a container. So what is the delivery point for you? Is either container yard or CFS, container freight station. Suppose if you are exporting goods through container, then you need to apply these terms only, any mode or modes of transport. Those terms are appropriate. Even if the containers are moved by sea, the main carriage is by sea, but seller is handing over the container in the container yard or container freight station. So, what is the appropriate international commercial term for that kind of arrangement is any mode. You have to take any mode or modes of transport terms. Whereas, if the shipments are a bulk shipments, like if you are exporting coal or crude oil or bagged rice, non-basmati rice, maybe 10,000 tons, 15,000 tons, 20,000 tons, like that. So, the seller can load the goods on board the ship. So, seller is accessible to the ship. Seller will go and load the goods on board the ship. In such case, the most appropriate international commercial terms are sea and inland waterways. So, those 4 terms, whatever terms are given under sea and inland waterway, they are primarily suitable or appropriate for bulk shipments, where seller is having access for the loading of the goods on board the ship. Whereas if it is a containerized cargo, seller cannot access to load the container on board the ship. So seller can deliver the container only at the container yard, or the goods can be stuffed in container freight station. So that is the reason we are saying for container shipments, these terms are sea and inland waterway terms are not appropriate. Okay, now let us understand all these international commercial terms where the seller's risk is passing to the buyer. That is very important thing. Suppose if you understand what is the point of delivery where seller's risk is passing to the buyer, then thereafter it is always buyer's risk. It is any costs associated or always to the buyer's account. So you must focus on the delivery point. So up to what stage is the seller's responsibility, and automatically thereafter it would be the buyer's responsibility. So now you have under any modes of transport you said X works, FCA, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, DDP. These 7 terms are there under any mode or modes of transport. And you have 4 terms: FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF. These 4 terms are given under sea and inland waterways. As I said, these 4 terms are most appropriate for the bulk shipments. Now let us understand against each term what is the place of delivery. First one, X works. You have to always insert place of delivery. Whenever you are using international commercial term, that abbreviated 3-letter term, you have to always insert place of delivery. What is this place of delivery against X works? You can be more specific. You can also give not only the place, you give entire address, and you can give the point of delivery also. If you have multiple points are there for delivery, you can specify the point of delivery also. Suppose if you write X works, Hyderabad warehouse. Hyderabad is a big place. So always you have to specify the exact location. And in that particular location, if you know the point of delivery exact, you may be having a big complex of warehouse. There may be lot of shutters. Suppose if you know exact point of delivery, you can specify that point of delivery as well. So you have to be specific. So now what we have to understand is, what are the seller's obligations when you adopt X works? So seller must keep the stock apportioned ready for delivery. That is only the responsibility in case of X works. Seller has to keep the stock ready for delivery. That's it. So if you have to pack the goods as per the contract, you have to pack it. If any markings are required on the packing as per the sales contract, you have to put the markings. Suppose if the contract does not describe how to pack the goods or what markings are required, then if this particular commodity requires packing, then you have to pack it as appropriate, suitable for transportation, including marking, like handle with care, something like that. If you want to put on the packing some marking which is appropriate and required for transportation of the goods. So, if the contract is silent about the packing or marking, still it is the seller's responsibility to pack the goods as appropriate for transportation, suitable for transportation. Suppose that particular item is not required to be packed, like suppose say some iron rods or some bricks, coal. So these things you don't generally pack it. So this particular item not required to be packed for transportation, there is no need for you. But always it is better to incorporate in the sales contract how to pack the goods. So now the seller's responsibility is to apportion the goods against this contract. You have to keep it aside. So once the goods are ready for delivery, you have to apportion the goods separately against this order. And then you will give the notice to the buyer stating that the goods are ready for delivery, and buyer also can give sometime notice to the seller at what time he will be coming along with the truck. And you should also employ the labor. The buyer must come with the truck and he must also employ his own labor to lift the goods onto the truck. So what I am saying is, in case of ex works, seller's responsibility is very minimum. Keep the stocks ready for delivery, apportion it separately against this order and give the notice to the buyer. So buyer must come with his own truck and he should also employ the labor to load the goods onto the truck. It means what? Even during the loading operations onto the truck, if there is a damage to the goods, it is the responsibility of the buyer only. So seller's delivery means he is just keeping the stock ready. And thereafter, we have discussed lot of other charges. Loading charges, we said buyer only has to come with the labor. Freight, that is transportation charges, buyer only has to pay. And insurance, if required, buyer will take it. It is up to the buyer, because buyer is taking the responsibility and the risk. So it is up to him. Whether he want to take the insurance, he can take the insurance. And if the goods are bought in the course of export, then buyer is responsible to get the export clearance. And anyway, in buyer's country, import clearance, it is buyer's responsibility. And unloading charges at buyer's place, anyway, it is buyer's responsibility. So, seller's risk and responsibility is a very minimum. So, but this ex works is not that appropriate for international trade. Because when you have to clear the goods for exportation in the seller's country, in most of the countries, the person who is taking the clearance of the goods for exportation must have registration in that country. So it means what? Buyer should have registration in seller's country. Then only he can move the goods after clearance from the customs authorities. So that is the reason the application of ex works in international trade is very nominal. So now let us understand FCA. FCA means free carrier. Again, you have to insert place of delivery. FCA, free carrier. You have to insert the place of delivery. So this place of delivery can be either seller's place or carrier's place. Suppose if it is a seller's place, so seller is delivering the goods at his place to whom? To the carrier, free carrier, at a named place. What is the named place? In this example, seller's place. So FCA, seller's place, whatever the place you have to specify in the contract. In this case, again, buyer has to engage the carrier, that is shipping company, or buyer also can come with his own vehicle. So, but loading the goods onto the truck is the responsibility of the seller. Please understand the difference between ex works and FCA as far as loading onto the truck is concerned. In case of ex works delivery at his place, loading has to be completed by the buyer. Whereas in case of FCA, delivery at seller's warehouse, seller must load the goods onto the truck. And seller must clear the goods for exportation. So this export clearance must be completed by the seller in case of FCA. So seller can deliver the goods at his place. If he is delivering the goods at his place, so seller has to load the goods onto the truck. Or seller may be required to deliver the goods at carrier's place, the shipping company place. In that case, seller has to use his own vehicle. So seller has to load the goods on to the truck, and seller has to carry the goods up to carrier's place ready for unloading. There is no need for the seller to unload the goods from the truck. So what is his responsibility, seller's responsibility here? Free carrier at named place. So seller must deliver the goods to the shipping company at that place. Whatever the place you are including in the sales contract. If you are including that place as seller's warehouse, then buyer has to come with the vehicle. Seller has to load the goods. Suppose as per the sales contract, if it is FCA, place of delivery is carrier's place. So seller is required to deliver the goods to the carrier at his place, carrier's place. Then seller has to engage his own truck, carry the goods up to that place, carrier's place, and keep it ready for unloading. There is no need for the seller to unload the goods. Okay. So export clearance, payment of duties to the customs authorities must be the seller's account. So insurance, up to carrier's place, it is seller's risk. So seller want to cover the insurance, you cover the insurance. If you have confidence, you don't want to take the insurance, it's up to you. Because seller's delivery is completing at carrier's place. So up to that carrier's place, it is the responsibility of the seller. So whether he want to take the insurance, he can take the insurance. If you don't want to take the insurance, it's up to you. And thereafter, it is buyers. So from the carrier's place to buyer's country, it is the buyer's responsibility to arrange the transportation. So who is arranging the main carriage? For example, goods are moving from India to Dubai. So seller is required to deliver the goods to the shipping company at his place. Thereafter, the goods are carried to Dubai. So from the shipping company premises, once the shipping company takes over the charge of the goods, that shipping company will take the goods to the Dubai. So who is appointing the shipping company? Buyer is appointing the shipping company. Seller has role only to deliver the goods up to this place. So import clearance in buyer's country, it is the buyer's responsibility. Unloading at buyer's country, it is buyer's responsibility. Suppose if the goods are going through sea after handing over the goods to the carrier. Now under International Commercial Terms 2020, they have included a provision that in case of FCA, free carrier also, though seller's responsibility is to deliver the goods at a carrier's place, suppose if seller's banker require the proof of shipment, if the goods are moving by sea, then the buyer can instruct the shipping company to release the proof of shipment document, that is bill of lading, to the seller, so that seller can present the bill of lading to the bank. But as far as FCA is concerned, free carrier, seller's risk passing to the buyer once goods are kept ready for unloading at the either carrier's place. So that is the reason what document the carrier will issue to the shipping company, to the seller, is some acknowledgement of the goods. Whereas as far as Incoterms 2020 is concerned, they have given a provision that in case of FCA, the main carriage is by sea. Main carriage means from carrier's place to, for example, say Dubai. If the goods are going by sea to Dubai, then the buyer can instruct the shipping company to release a bill of lading, that is the proof of shipment document, to the seller. So seller will get a bill of lading once the goods are loaded on board the ship. So when can shipping company can give the proof of shipment? Once the goods are shipped. Once the goods are shipped, then shipping company can give the proof of shipment document, that is called bill of lading, to the seller, so that seller can present this document to the bank that the goods are already exported. Maybe he may require some finance. Okay, but when it comes to the risk point, that is same. It's only additional feature that they have added in Incoterms 2020. It's an additional feature. If both the seller and the buyer agree only, then the buyer can instruct the shipping company to release a bill of lading to the seller. Otherwise, in case of FCA, seller delivers the goods ready for unloading at carrier's place. Okay. Next one is FAS, free alongside the ship. Again, you have to insert port of loading. Free alongside the ship, port of loading. Suppose port of loading is Mumbai. You have to insert Mumbai port. FAS, Mumbai port. Free alongside the ship. It means the seller is responsible to carry the goods up to alongside the ship. So suppose there are two types of ports are there. One, anchorage port or natural harbor. Suppose in case of anchorage port, the ship will stand maybe a couple of kilometers away from the port. Because at the port it is not that depth. Ship cannot stand here. So ship will be there where it is comfortable. The depth is comfortable. So ship will be anchored there. That is the reason we call it as anchorage port. So in case of FAS, seller must carry the goods alongside the ship, up to alongside the ship. Suppose if it is a natural harbor, the ship will come to the platform. So you can keep the stock on the platform alongside the ship. Thereafter, the loading of the goods on board the ship is the responsibility of the buyer. So, seller is responsible to keep the stocks alongside the ship. In case of natural harbor, on the platform alongside the ship, or if it is the anchorage port, you have to carry the goods in the barges or wooden boats up to that anchorage place, and you have to keep alongside the ship. So, loading operations on board the ship, that is the responsibility of the buyer. And then next term is FOB, free on board. Again insert the port of loading. Say in this example, if you are saying Mumbai port, FOB Mumbai port. In this case, the seller is responsible to load the goods on board the ship. In FAS, seller is responsible to keep the stock alongside the ship. In case of FOB, seller is responsible to load the goods on board the ship. Here, as we said, the export clearance, seller only has to clear the export formalities. Only in case of ex works, only in case of ex works, seller is not responsible for clearance of the goods for exportation. In all other terms, it is the seller's responsibility to clear the goods for exportation. Only in case of ex works, it is not the responsibility of the seller to clear the goods for exportation, but in all other Incoterms, it is the responsibility of the seller to clear the goods for exportation. So when I am saying free alongside ship or free on board, who is arranging the ship? It is the buyer. In case of free carrier, also we said, buyer is responsible to appoint or enter into a contract of carriage. So buyer must appoint the carrier. Seller will keep the stock ready for unloading in case of FCA. So main transportation must be arranged by the buyer. Similarly, in case of FAS, free alongside the ship, or in case of FOB, free on board, it is the responsibility of the buyer to bring the ship to the port. Seller is only load the goods on board the ship in case of FOB. So there is a lot of coordination is required between the seller and the buyer. So seller must be ready with the stock and give notice to the buyer so that buyer can bring the ship. Suppose if the stock is not ready with the seller, if the buyer is bringing the ship, then what is use? Okay, so now you may be thinking why there are two terms are existing like FAS and FOB. When the seller is carrying the goods up to this place alongside the ship, then why not he load the goods on board the ship? Why there are two terms are there, FAS and FOB? So when seller is carrying the goods up to this place, and seller can load the goods on board the ship, then what is the need for FAS, free alongside the ship? Is because this loading operation on board the ship is called stevedoring activity. Loading the goods on board the ship. This is a very complicated process because the goods must be loaded on board the ship according to the stowage plan given by the captain of the ship and chief officer of the ship. How to place the goods in the holds, hatches, so that the stability of the ship is not at stake. See, suppose against for this ship is capable of carrying 20,000 metric tons. The capacity of the ship is say 20,000 metric tons. Suppose for the buyer, he could not find one supplier who can supply entire 20,000 metric tons. But buyer need 20,000 metric tons. So buyer may purchase from say two parties. So party A is selling 10,000 metric tons and party B is selling another 10,000 metric tons. So if they enter into a contract on FOB basis, party A is responsible to load the goods on board the ship and party B is also responsible to load the goods on board the ship in case if the sales contract, if they agree on FOB basis. So it means both A and B are responsible to load the goods on board the ship. So they may appoint their own stevedoring agent, the activity of loading. So party A, he want to appoint somebody, and party B, he want to appoint some other stevedoring agent to load the goods. But as I said, it is a very difficult operation, keeping in mind the stability of the ship. Because this loading based on the stowage plan given by the captain and the chief officer of the ship. So this stevedoring agent, he should closely work with the captain and the chief officer of the ship to load the goods. And when they are making this stowage plan, how to load the goods of this 20,000 metric tons, they will also keep in mind the discharge port. How to discharge goods? Suppose if there are multiple discharge ports, because the ship is going to discharge this 20,000 metric tons in 2 different ports. So in first port, they unloaded 10,000 metric tons. If they unload 10,000 metric tons in the first port, then ship stability should not be at stake. Suppose if you load entire cargo here, first 10,000 tons if you load here, party A's cargo is ready, so 10,000 metric tons he loaded here, the ship will go like this. So that is the reason you have to always spread the goods. So it is purely a logistical issue, not related to our topic exactly, but we should understand why there are 2 terms are existing. If there are multiple suppliers are there for the ship, always buyer prefers to enter into a contract with FAS delivery term, free alongside the ship. So he will take charge for appointing the stevedoring agent. So buyer will appoint the stevedoring agent. So sellers, both of them will carry the goods alongside the ship. That's it. Suppose if there are single supplier, then always buyer prefers to enter into a contract on FOB basis, so that seller can load the goods on board the ship. So, as I said, these 2 terms, FAS and FOB, these 2 terms are used for bulk shipments like coal, crude oil. Not for containerized goods, these 2 terms are not appropriate. Because in case of containerized goods, you are handing over the container in the container yard or delivering the goods at the container freight station. But whereas in case of FOB, goods to be loaded on board the ship by the seller. In case of container, seller cannot access the loading operations. So seller can only hand over the container at the container yard. So that is the difference. So next one, carriage paid to. Carriage paid to. Insert again place of destination. Suppose say as our example says, destination is Dubai. So you have to include place of destination. Carriage paid to Dubai, some buyer's warehouse. So here again there is 2 possibilities. One, the seller can deliver at his warehouse, or seller can deliver the goods at a carrier's place. So what is CPT? Carriage paid to Dubai. So who is paying the transportation charges? Seller is paying the transportation charges. Up to where? Up to the destination. Seller is paying the transportation charges up to the destination. Carriage paid to the carrier. He has to hand over the goods. Where he can hand over the goods? Either in his place, either at his own seller's place, or at the shipping company, carrier's place. So here, in case of CPT, you must understand, you should know what is the delivery point. So the delivery point is not Dubai. Though seller is paying transportation charges up to the Dubai, but the risk is passing from seller to buyer at the seller's country only. Please understand the difference. Though seller is paying the transportation charges up to destination, seller's risk is passing to the buyer in seller's country only, once the goods are handed over to the shipping company. So, in the sales contract, you have to incorporate what is the delivery point. In case of all other terms, what we have discussed earlier, X-works you are writing seller's place, that is the delivery point. FCI you are writing place of delivery, that is the delivery point. Meaning seller's risk is passing to the buyer. Similarly, we have discussed about FOB. Seller's risk is passing to the buyer at load port. Loading port is Mumbai. So seller's risk is passing to the buyer at load port in Mumbai. So you are also writing here port of loading Mumbai port. FOB Mumbai port. But whereas in case of CPT, and not only CPT, other terms like CIP, CFR, CIF, all these four terms under C, seller is responsible to arrange the transportation and pay the freight charges up to the destination, but seller's risk is passing to the buyer in his own country, that is seller's country. So that is the reason you must incorporate in the sales contract what is the delivery place. Delivery place can be seller's warehouse, or if the goods are going by flight, for example, by air, so seller may deliver the goods to the carrier at airport. Suppose if the goods are going by container, seller may deliver the container to the shipping company at container yard. So, where is the risk is passing? Risk is passing where you are entering into if you are mentioning in the contract, whatever is the delivery point, you are mentioning in the contract. Not Dubai. Here you are mentioning CPT Dubai. Dubai is the destination, but it is not a delivery point. The risk is passing from seller to the buyer in seller's country only, wherever he is handing over the goods to the shipping company. Suppose if it is a multimodal transportation, From the seller's warehouse, it is going by truck, thereafter by sea. I repeat, if it is a multimodal transport, from the seller's warehouse, the goods are going by truck and thereafter by sea. There are two modes of transportation involved under multimodal transport. So where the seller's risk is passing to the buyer is at his warehouse. At his warehouse, if you clearly mention in the sales contract. So at his warehouse, once the goods are loaded on the truck, at seller's warehouse, then seller's risk is passing to the buyer. Though seller is paying the transportation charges up to Dubai. So in this example you have by road and you have by sea also. For both the seller must pay the transportation charges. The risk is passing to the buyer at a specified place. If the specified place is the seller's warehouse, then once the goods loaded onto the truck, then seller's risk is passing to the buyer. So as we discussed earlier, export clearance must always to be taken care by the seller, but for X works. So export clearance anyway seller must take care. Even if he is delivering the goods at his warehouse, he should clear the goods for exportation wherever it is. And import clearance, as we discussed, it is the responsibility of the buyer. And unloading charges anyway, it is the responsibility of the buyer. So when it comes to insurance, as explained, up to that delivery point, it is the seller's risk and thereafter it is the buyer's risk. Seller want to take the insurance, he can take up to that point of delivery. Suppose if buyer want to take the insurance, buyer must take the insurance thereafter. It's up to them. And the next term is CIP, carriage insurance paid to. Carriage insurance paid to Dubai in such place of destination. Destination is Dubai. It is very similar to CPT. Only additional thing is the seller is responsible to cover the insurance up to the destination. Seller must cover the insurance up to the destination from the delivery place. So you must mention in the sales contract what is the delivery place. From the delivery place as mentioned in the contract up to the destination, seller must cover the insurance in addition to the transportation. Carriage insurance paid to Dubai. So as discussed, again the risk is passing from seller to the buyer in the seller's country only. Though seller is taking insurance up to the destination, the risk is passing from seller to the buyer in the seller's country only. So, what type of risk you have to cover? You have to specify in the sales contract. Always it is recommended. Any additional activities, extra activities, you always, any specific requirements are there, always better to incorporate in the sales contract. What type of risks you have to cover? So, because buyer is paying for it. So, suppose if you do not mention what are the risks to be covered in the sales contract, then you must cover, as a seller, must cover the Institute Cargo Clauses A, ICCA. You have to cover ICC. In case of CIP, ICCA, Institute Cargo Clauses A. A stands for all risks. That is the maximum risk. So all risk coverage policy. Institute Cargo Clauses A stands for all risks. So in the sales contract, you must specify what are the risks to be covered for insurance. In absence of that, if the sales contract is silent as to what risks to be covered, then as per international commercial terms, you must cover Institute Cargo Clauses A, all risks. For how much? Is a minimum of 110% of the goods value. On the goods value, you have to add a minimum of 10% more. You have to cover the insurance up from place of delivery in seller's country to the destination. At least up to the destination. You can cover later after that. But at least up to the destination, you have to cover. So when it comes to insurance point, what you have to keep it in mind is, in case of CIP, if the sales contract is silent about the risks to be covered, then seller must cover ICCA clauses, Institute Cargo Clauses A. In case of air shipments, air. So that is for what amount? At least a minimum of 110% of the goods value. Because the price is inclusive of insurance amount. So buyer is paying for it. So the next one is CFR, cost and freight insert port of destination. Cost and freight insert port of destination. So here also, seller is responsible to arrange the transportation up to the port of destination. Port of destination. However, seller's risk is passing to the buyer in seller's country only once the goods are loaded on board the ship. So in the sales contract, you will know what is the delivery port. Port of loading, Mumbai. Port of discharge, that is port of destination, Dubai. So in the Incoterm, what you are mentioning, CFR, Dubai. Dubai port. From where? You have to specify. From where? From Mumbai. Mumbai to Dubai. So from Mumbai to Dubai, who is paying the transportation? Who is arranging the transport? Who is entering into a contract of carriage? He is the seller. Seller is entering into a contract of carriage with the shipping company. Seller is paying the freight charges, ocean freight charges, up to Dubai. But the risk from the seller to the buyer is passing in Mumbai, that is load port, once the goods are loaded on board the ship. Like FOB. FOB we said, once the goods are loaded on board the ship, the risk is passing from seller to the buyer. What is the difference between these two? In case of FOB, buyer is arranging the ship. In case of FOB, buyer is arranging the ship. In case of CFR, seller is arranging the ship. But risk is same. Risk is passing from seller to the buyer at load port once the goods are loaded on board the ship. And the other one, CIF, cost, insurance and freight. Again, insert port of destination. CIF Dubai. Similar to that CIP. So what is the difference between CFR and CIF? CIF requires insurance to be taken by the seller from the port of loading to the port of discharge. Seller is taking the insurance, but risk is passing from seller to the buyer at load port only once the goods are loaded on board the ship. But in this case, CIF, what risks are to be covered? Here, as far as Incoterms 2020 is concerned, in the absence of risks to be covered in the sales contract, you must cover ICCC, Institute Cargo Clauses C. That is the least coverage. Whereas for CIP, we said Institute Cargo Clauses A. That is the maximum cover, higher cover. Whereas in case of CIF, we said ICCC, Institute Cargo Clauses C, that is the lowest cover. In the previous version of Incoterms, that is Incoterms 2010, this difference was not there. Please understand, don't get confused. In the previous version of International Commercial Terms 2010, either in CIP or in case of CIF, the coverage required was ICCC, Institute Cargo Clauses C, if you don't mention anything. But as far as Incoterms 2020 is concerned, for CIP, you need to cover Institute Cargo Clauses A, that is higher risk. And in case of CIF, it is Institute Cargo Clauses C, that is the lower coverage. Why? Because, see, always you have to keep it in mind, high value goods will go in a container. High value goods will go in a container. So that is the reason we said, in case of containerized shipments, CPT or CIP, they are appropriate terms, not CFR and CIF. Containerized goods usually of higher value. And bulk shipments like coal, value is less, volume is more. Volume is more, value is less. Because value is less, they thought ICCC, the lower level of coverage is sufficient in absence of risks in the sales contract. It is always advisable that the buyer and seller must incorporate risks to be covered in the sales contract always. If you don't mention in the sales contract, Then in case of CIF, because usually CIF is for bulk cargoes, so Institute Cargo Clauses C, they thought it is enough. In case of containerized goods, high value, low volume, like basmati rice. Basmati rice may go in, say, container. Usually, cashew nuts, almonds. So they go, or gold shipments. They may go in containers. So value is high, volume is lesser. Because value is high, then they thought ICC-A is needed, higher level of risk coverage. That is only the difference. But either it is CIP or CIF, you must cover at least 110% of the goods value. And the next term, delivered at place. Insert place of destination. So here, seller is responsible to deliver the goods at buyer's country, ready for unloading. So there is no need for the seller to unload the goods, to arrange unloading the goods at buyer's country in that particular place. But you have to arrange the entire transportation. The risk is passing from seller to the buyer in buyer's country. So far, in E term, E we have one term, F series we have FCA, FAS, FOB, 3 terms are there. In C series, you have 4 terms. E series, F series and C series. Seller's risk is passing to the buyer in seller's country only. But here, D series, delivered at place. The seller's risk is passing to the buyer in buyer's country. Here in this case, delivered at place, they are ready for unloading. There is no need for the seller to unload the goods there. But in this particular Incoterm, the import clearance also must be covered by the buyer only. Though seller is taking the goods, seller is responsible to carry the goods up to that place, whatever the place. The import clearance must be taken care by the buyer only. Like all other terms, it is the buyer's duty to clear the goods for importation, though seller is arranging the transportation up to that place agreed in the buyer's country. And the other term, delivered at place unloaded. Here, unloaded. What is the difference between DAP and DPU? In case of DPU, you have to unload the goods. Seller is responsible to unload the goods at the buyer's country at that specified place. Earlier, this term was used as DAT, delivered at the terminal. Delivered at terminal under Incoterms 2010. Incoterms 2010, this particular term was called as DAT, delivered at terminal. So, at terminal, in the importing country, seller must arrange the unloading. So while they are redrafting International Commercial Terms 2020, they thought, why only terminal? Why not any other place at buyer's country? So that is the reason, if you use the DPU, it means seller is responsible to unload the goods at buyer's country at a specified place. That place could be either port or carrier's place or buyer's place. Any place, whatever you specify in the buyer's country. In the buyer's country, it could be the port, delivered, at place. That place can be sometimes port also. DPU, if it is the port, unload it. If it is a place, again seller must arrange for unloading. So as I said, the import clearance must be taken care by the buyer. Like all other terms, buyer is responsible to clear the goods for importation. The next term is DDP, delivered duty paid. Delivered duty paid. Insert place of destination. So, here in this case, what is the additional thing is, the buyer is not responsible for import clearance. It is the seller's responsibility to clear the goods for both export and import. Please understand, in case of delivered duty paid, seller is responsible to clear the goods for importation also. And whatever the local VAT taxes are there, that is seller's responsibility. But here, there is no need for you to unload. Unloading is not seller's responsibility. Unloading is seller's responsibility in case of only DPU. That U stands for unloading. In DAP or DDP, unloading at buyer's country is not responsibility of the seller. Only in case of DPU, seller's responsibility to unload the goods in buyer's country. In case of this last one, delivered duty paid, it is the seller's responsibility to clear the goods importation also. So here, the seller is having the maximum responsibility. Whereas, in case of Ex Works, we said seller has a limited minimum responsibility. In case of Ex Works, seller has to just keep the stocks ready for delivery, a portion, that's it. Least responsibility. He need not even load the goods onto the truck, just keep the stocks ready for delivery. That is the responsibility in case of Ex Works for the seller. So least responsibility. Here, in case of delivered duty paid, seller has the most responsibility, including the import clearance for the goods. So we have given the footnote also. Export clearance, always it is seller's account, except Ex Works. Only in case of Ex Works, export clearance must be taken care by the seller. Footnote 2, import clearance, buyer's account. import clearance always to buyer's account except in case of DDP, delivered duty paid. And again, we have already discussed insurance coverage. CAP, you have to cover the insurance classes A, Institute Cargo classes A. CIF, Institute Cargo class C is enough. In case your sales contract is silent about what the risks to be covered. So, X works delivery place is warehouse. Seller need not load the goods. So, all the costs are to the account of the buyer. In case of FCA, there are two possible delivery places. One at seller's place. If it is a seller's place, then in case of FCA, seller has to load the goods onto the truck. That's it. If it is at carrier's place, seller has to carry the goods up to the carrier's place and ready for unloading. It means it is not the seller's duty to unload the goods at carrier's place. So the main carriage that will be taken care by the buyer. So buyer will appoint the carrier. This who will appoint this carrier? Free carrier means buyer will appoint the carrier. Seller will deliver the goods to him. So buyer will take the goods. So transportation charges, main transportation charges, buyer only will pay. Similarly, FAS we have discussed, free alongside the ship and free on board the ship, FOB. In both the cases again, it is the buyer who must arrange the transportation. So buyer has to place the ship. So buyer has to pay the transportation charges for the ocean journey. Seller, in case of FOB, has to load the goods on board the ship. So the seller risk is passing to the buyer once the goods are loaded on board the ship. Similarly, CPT and CIP, you have to show destination place. In all other C terms, CPT, CIP, CF or CIF, the seller is paying the freight. In case of CIP and CIF, seller is paying the freight and insurance also up to the destination, but risk is passing from seller to the buyer in the exporter country only. What is the delivery point? Delivery place? Seller's country only. Only in case of D terms, delivered at place unloaded, delivered duty paid. For these three, delivery happens in the buyer's country. However, import clearance must be taken care by the buyer against delivered at place and delivered at place unloaded. Buyer has to clear. Only in case of delivered duty paid, seller has to arrange for import clearance also. So which is very difficult. So that is the reason in international trade, we hardly use, because in buyer's country, clearing the goods for importation from customs authorities, in those countries, the seller may have to have registration. So it may be very difficult, like X works. So X works hardly we use in international trade. As we said, just because we are calling it as international commercial terms, it does not mean that it is used for only international trade. These terms can be used only or also for domestic trade. So whenever you are adopting international commercial term in your sales contract, you must always specify the source, Incoterms 2020. The source is important. There is no need for you to put the registration symbol, the registered trademark symbol. That registered trademark symbol is not required, but you have to give Incoterms 2020 for any term. FOB Mumbai Port Incoterms 2020. That is how you have to incorporate in your sales contract. So always you remember X work price will be lesser as compared to, for example, say CFR, CIF or DAP, because as seller's responsibility increases, escalates, the price will go up. So X works price will be lesser and DDP price will be more. Because as seller's responsibility increases, cost increases, the price also will increase accordingly. So that is the reason in the sales contract, against the price, if you give only a numerical number, does not convey any meaning unless you mention the Incoterm with the delivery place. Unit price $10 per metric ton. So dollar, that is the currency unit. 10 is the number. 10 per metric ton. Where? Because there is a movement of the goods is involved. From seller's place to the buyer's place. So where you want to deliver, if you don't mention, then there is no meaning for the $10 per metric ton. So you have to specify, even if it is X works, X warehouse, in your factory, in your showroom, X showroom, you have to clearly mention. So $10 per metric ton, FCA, Mumbai. Suppose if it is a CPT, then you cannot supply for $10 per metric ton because you are incurring additional cost. Whatever you are incurring additional cost, transportation charges. Seller is paying in case of CPT transportation charges up to Dubai. So you have to add those transportation charges to the price. So price will increase. So always you have to mention in the sales contract $10 per metric ton CFR, Dubai, CPT, Dubai, whatever. The only numerical number along with the currency unit does not convey any meaning unless you clearly incorporate relevant international commercial term with the delivery place. So again, in case of CAP and CIF, seller is taking insurance for the account of the buyer. If there is a damage to the goods, the buyer should claim from the insurance company, not the seller. Seller is arranging the insurance. Suppose if there is a damage to the goods, it is the buyer should go and claim the insurance. It is not the seller's duty. The seller's risk is passing to the buyer in seller's country only. In case of CPT or CIP, as we said, it can be passed in the warehouse also once the goods are loaded onto the truck in case of multimodal transportation. Halfway by road and thereafter by sea. In case of CPT or CIP, once the goods are handed over to the first carrier, if there are more than one mode of transportation is involved, first carrier, once the goods are handed over, the seller's risk is passing to the buyer. Suppose seller is having his factory in Hyderabad. Hyderabad, you don't have any seaport. The goods are going via Bombay. Bombay, we have seaport to Dubai. So from Hyderabad to Bombay by road and from Bombay to Dubai by sea. It is called multimodal. Road and sea, more than one mode of transportation is involved. So in this case, if you are taking CIP, where is delivery happening? In Hyderabad. Though you are taking insurance up to Dubai, seller's risk is passing to the buyer in Dubai, in Hyderabad. And in case of damage to the goods, it is the responsibility of the buyer to claim insurance. So always you have to think from the seller's perspective, where seller's risk is passing to the buyer, thereafter it is the buyer's risk. Insurance matter is coming to picture only in case of two terms, CIP and CIF. Because the buyer is paying seller to take the insurance. Buyer wants insurance to be covered by the seller, so the price is increased. So seller is just arranging the insurance for the buyer. So if there is a damage to the goods during the carriage, it is buyer who should go and claim money from the insurance company. So why we are adopting international commercial terms is because by adopting international commercial terms in sales contract, your contract size will come down substantially. It is very difficult to incorporate all seller's obligations and buyer's obligations in a sales contract. However, if you can specify all seller's obligations in buyer's obligations, and it is a common understanding, common language between buyer and the seller, then it is fine. But you can reduce, minimize the size of the contract. If you minimize, then there is a limited scope for misinterpretations. If there are misinterpretations, then it may lead to misunderstandings. So that is the reason seller and the buyer must understand international commercial terms 2020 and incorporate in their contract suitably. Whatever the term is suitable for their operation, you have to incorporate. So FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF, these four terms are exclusively used for sea shipments, that is port to port shipments, port of loading and port of discharge. Starting point, delivery point is port of loading, the ending point port of destination. So in all these cases, FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF, port of loading and port of discharge. So the delivery, in case of in case of FAS, you have to keep alongside the ship. Otherwise, remaining three terms, seller has to load the goods on board the ship. There is delivery happens on board the ship. The risk is passing on board the ship to the buyer. So that is only the reason why we say for containerized cargo, you always adopt CPT or CIP or FCA. Whatever is appropriate. Suppose if buyer is paying the transportation for main carriage, then you adopt FCA in case of container. Suppose if seller is paying, then you go for CPT if it is a containerized cargo. Don't use CFR, because CFR is meant for commodities loading on board the ship, like bulk shipments. So I'm sure I have covered all aspects of International Commercial Terms 2020. So you can also go through the material supply bias and you will be very clear as far as Incoterms 2020 is concerned. Thank you.